Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today in joining my other colleagues, organized by my friend, the Senator from Hawaii, to ask my colleagues to vote against the resolution, which I think we'll be taking up literally in the next 10 minutes, which would strip away a common sense Department of Labor rule that simply provides fiduciaries. Remember who we're talking about, fiduciaries. People who are responsible under ERISA plans to think about their beneficiaries over the long term. We are trying to make sure that those fiduciaries who are charged with maintaining retirement plans with the ability to adequately account for environmental, social, and governance factors. Now, I know some of my colleagues have come on the floor and say, this is an attempt by the Department of Labor to somehow mandate the retirement investments of hardworking Americans. Nothing could be further from the truth. Truth is, we look at profit and loss, we look at cash reserves, we look at financial accounting, but the idea that environmental, social, and governance factors can't even be looked at is an interference in the business cycle that really kind of goes beyond the pale. Now, I am often regarded, I have to acknowledge this, Madam President, in my caucus as sometimes being the member who's got the most experience with capitalism, or the most experience with business. And I absolutely believe in our system. There's nothing better. But the idea that today, and I want to copy some of the comments that have been made, but the idea of today, for a lot of folks who have never been able to read a balance sheet are going to come in and tell paid fiduciaries what they consider or what they can't consider in terms of the long-term economic returns for their beneficiaries. I wonder if things gotten a little topsy-turvy here. Now, I could imagine if some people were saying, well, we need to make sure we have this rule in place or overrule this rule or put this binding in place if you're talking about day traders or if you're talking about a hedge fund that only looks at the next quarter's results. The kind of short-term capitalism that too often I think is eating at the core of our great system. But if we're going to look at long-term returns, we ought to take and have to take into consideration factors, in many cases, factors that may not have been as relevant 30, 50, 70 years ago. Somehow we're going to say we can't look at those. And unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle have decided to take away a useful term, a useful set of analysis, something that has been asked for by these pension funds, by these beneficiaries, and instead try to turn it into a political item. Let me call back. 75 years ago, if you look at the Fortune 500 and the companies that were involved in that Fortune 500, about roughly 75 to 80% of these companies' assets were tangible assets. What does that mean? It means it was their plant, it was their equipment, it was their machinery. Fast forward, and a lot of this due to great innovation in the technology field, those same Fortune 500 companies, which are dramatically different than the companies named 60, 70 years ago, you look at their balance sheet today, 75, 80% of their assets are intangible assets. Well, what are intangible assets? Intangible assets are things like intellectual property, and that is coming about from a healthy workforce. But more than anything else, it is the men and women who work at these firms, and virtually every CEO I've heard from in the last 10 years have said, my biggest asset is my workforce. And the idea that somehow, because ESG is not just E, it is also S, and that falls into workforce, the idea that somehow a pension fund can't look at workforce retention, workforce quality, workforce characteristics as a measure of what they want to invest in, to me is a little wacky. And let me actually call on a reference sort person who I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will acknowledge, and that was President Trump's chairman of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, Jay Clayton, who I had a very good working relationship with. He said that human capital disclosures can and should inform investment decisions. As Chair Clayton said, quote, "Our current disclosure requirements date back to a time when companies relied significantly on plant, property, and equipment to derive value. Today, human capital represents an essential driver of performance for many companies, albeit in different ways." So under Mr. Trump's SEC, there was a rulemaking process started to make sure that human capital components can be an appropriate focus of reviews, particularly for companies and entities that want to invest for the long term. I'm concerned that this approach that we're taking today might indirectly preclude those fiduciaries who represent pension funds, long-term investors, are no longer going to be able to actually look at this critical criteria around human capital. Now, the other thing is the Department of Labor rule, and I know a lot of my colleagues have spoken to this, talk about, well, what about the environment? Well, I think we all would recognize, or most of us recognize, the fact that climate change is real and poses a rapidly growing threat to the long-term feasibility of investments made on behalf of hardworking Americans. Now, while this rule, this Department of Labor rule, won't direct our armed forces, I think it's really important to understand that the FFRDCs, the federally funded research development corporations, the RANDs, the MITREs, the CNA, with which I had the honor, which does naval work and analysis, federally funded, if we were going to apply these same kind of Department of Labor prohibitions on our armed forces, we couldn't allow the CNA to look at the long-term effects on the Navy, and I don't want to give away a secret here, but they've been looking at this issue for over 20 years. They couldn't make those kind of predictions about what the effect of sea level rise would have on our Navy. Well, I tell you, we're blessed in the Commonwealth of Virginia to have the world's largest Navy base in Norfolk. And I can assure you, virtually every year or every other year, we have to raise the piers, literally spend hundreds of millions of dollars to raise the piers to make sure that that Navy base can still be utilized. So if it's a smart enough, good enough requirement that the Navy and our armed forces are looking at the E of ESG, why would we preclude the private sector from doing that? Now, I think the Department of Labor's rule on ESG is both practical and necessary. I think those funds who choose not to abide by it, that's their right. That's what capitalism is all about, making choices. But the notion that we are going to somehow come in and impose requirements on the market and take away long-term investors' ability to consider human capital, to consider the effects of climate change, and I've not even touched, I know we're going to have to go to a vote, on issues around corporate governance, all which can lead to longer-term, better returns. If this was a rule about day traders and quarter-to-quarter hedge fund folks, I might get it. But in terms of protecting the long-term value creation in long-term sustainable capitalism, I think this effort today sadly misses the mark and will do a great deal of damage. I urge my colleagues when the vote comes to vote against the CRA. Thank you, Madam Chairman. With that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.